Russel Barsh is with us today. Very excited. Russel pursued careers in university teaching and international diplomacy before returning to the islands more than 20 years ago as the founding director of QUIAT, a nonprofit conservation biology laboratory that studies island ecosystems, marine and terrestrial, and works with public and private landowners to protect our most unusual habitats and species. QUIAT means a place that has been kept physically clean and spiritually healthy. He is best known for his research on the food web that sustains Chinook salmon and killer whales. But his interest in ecology of the San Juan Islands includes extensive research about bats, ticks, and native bees and hoverflies. QUIAT summer surveys of 19 uninhabited small islands around San Juan County have added to his knowledge of our native pollinators, in particular the role of cellophane bees, in case you've heard of those, digger bees, and bumblebees in maintaining wildflowers on islands as small as a few hundred square feet. Please join me in welcoming Russel.
Okay. Yeah, it was a little wild at my place last night with some howling wind and branches falling off of trees. But delightful to be here this morning with all of you. And I'm going to actually bring you a bit of a commercial message after I'm done, which is that QUIAT is going to be fundraising with the Orcas Island Community Foundation next month for a research project on pesticide impacts on Orcas Island. So a little bit more about that and an introduction of our Orcas Island coordinator here when I'm done with pollinators of the future. And I think about this in terms of our understanding of pollinator services as a function of our ecosystem, as something that benefits our gardens and our farms. And with climate change, as well as development and increased human population in the islands, we need to be conscious of how we are impacting pollinator services and what we can do to assure that we have pollinators in the future. Pollination is as old as the dinosaurs. The first flowering plants emerged about 125 million years ago, and not long after that, the first bees are found in the fossil record in amber, so that the relationship between flowering plants and bees, at least, is very ancient and is a co-evolutionary process in which flowers have adapted to attracting bees, and bees have evolved to take maximum advantage of what resources flowers can afford them. Bees have been around long enough that they've evolved into a number of distinct family lines. We have a number of them in our neighborhood. A couple of these families are only found in South America and in the tropics in the old world, but we have multiple families of bees that are now genetically distinct and serve different functions and have different requirements in terms of their use of pollen and nectar. The diversity of bees is one thing I really want to underscore. When people think about bees, all too often they think about honeybees. Honeybees are a domestic species. They're livestock like cows and chickens. And all of the honeybees in the world, all of the honey-producing honeybees in the world, really only derive from hybridization of 8 original wild Eurasian species. So their origin is in North Africa and Eurasia, and just 8 species that we've combined and recombined over probably over 2,000 years to result in the honey producers that are worldwide now. But there are about 20,000 species of wild bees. And here in North America, we have about 20% of that diversity. So about 4,000 species of bees in North America. And we're still discovering some new ones. In fact, the first comprehensive list of the wild native bees of Washington State was published last week. And they published it we saw the first prints of it on Monday last week. It said that there were 565 species of bees in Washington State. And the following week, the authors released a note to researchers saying they had just found the 566th. So we're still finding more bee species. It's an incredibly diverse group, as diverse as the floral resources that they depend upon. The thing that I would like to start you with is what's a bee and what makes a bee special. And a little bit of a test. I mean, what's wrong with this picture? This is kind of the bee that children see in books that we teach them about. Oh, bees are important, and pollinators and so on. And there were two things that you should immediately see that are fundamentally wrong with this picture, apart from the smiley face.
It's missing legs.
It's missing one pair of legs. Bees have 6.
2 wings.
And they have 2 wing pairs. So their typical view of bee is not only a little bit childish, but it's also not anatomically correct. But let's take a look at what is anatomically correct. But the special things about bees, I mean, insects have 5 legs. Many insects, certainly all the bees and wasps, have 2 wing pairs, but that's not what makes a bee. First of all, what makes a bee is it's an insect that eats pollen. Most adult insects will drink nectar as fuel, carbohydrates. So they're drinking nectar to get sugars, to power flight, at least during the adult stage of their lives. With bees, pollen is eaten for protein. So they're using nectar for fuel, for very much like us, using carbohydrates for fuel and pollen for protein. And that combination links them to flowers in a different way than the insects that simply visit flowers as adults a few times to refuel their sugars. Another thing that's very important that's related to this is that bees are fuzzy. The fuzziness has to do with picking up pollen efficiently. If you're smooth and shiny and you scramble around inside a flower, the pollen grains may fall off the anthers, but they may not stick to you. Pollen is spiky, but not necessarily sticky. If you were covered in nice fine hair, or setae in the terminology used by entomologists, you pick up pollen like you hoover it up. It all sticks to the hairs and you become completely coated in pollen that bees then groom off in the field and pack to bring home. So fuzziness is an absolute fundamental issue with beefulness. The other thing is that because bees need to maximize their ability to collect pollen on each flight and need to be able to transport large amounts of pollen on a single flight from their nest out to where there are pollen resources. Then we have a little feedback there, so I apologize for that now, and I'll try to keep my voice low for great.
We're gonna fix it, Russell, don't worry.
Okay. That bees all have some kind of special pollen packing device. In honeybees and the other Apidae, the family that they belong to, that includes corbicula, which are sometimes called pollen baskets, which are like hip pockets on the third pair of legs that you can pack pollen into, and then when the leg bends, it works like a nutcracker, but it compresses the pollen eventually into a pellet. So it's a really efficient way of getting more pollen to carry from the field to your nest. Other bee families have scopi, have hairs on usually the third pair of legs again, just long hairs like combs that pollen can be packed around, which is what you see here. There are also bees that have fuzzy bellies at the bottom of the abdomen. I'll show you some of them in just a little bit, that carry the pollen around packed on their belly on a velvety patch that allows them again to visit many flowers, pack a lot of pollen, and safely bring it home. So bees are not only fuzzy, but they have these specialized tools for packing securely large quantities of pollen before they return to their nests. One other thing that's very special about bees that's only been very recently understood is that bees and flowers communicate a lot using ultraviolet light. Bees don't see in the red area. So we see, of course, the old color wheel, Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, and violet that are visible to the human eye. Bees don't see red. The long range, the long frequency end of their vision is yellow. And you probably have seen in your garden, yellow flowers definitely attract bees. They see them, they don't see red. Red flowers are frequently hummingbird flowers rather than bee flowers. Or they're purple, and they're actually a combination of red and blue, and the bees see the blue, but not the red part of that. But they can see ultraviolet, and a lot of flowers, like the ones in the side panel there, that to us look white or pink or some other color, look bright, blindingly white, as it were, blindingly light to bees, because they actually reflect ultraviolet that we cannot see. So that's a very important thing in the way flowers and bees have co-evolved, is flowers can signal in ultraviolet a group of wavelengths that bees specially can notice as they're scanning for things to eat. Talking about senses, bees are really interesting, and I really personally enjoy watching this because they're highly exploratory. They'll land on flowers, and if you watch closely, you'll see they do two things. They touch the flower with their antenna. You see them using their antenna like little fingers, and then they trample it. They walk into it, touching it with their antenna. And that's because they have tasting sensors at the tips of the antenna and on their feet. So they can taste the flower through their feet and through the antenna. And what they're doing is they're walking around and doing this with their antenna, is they're trying to find the nectar and the pollen by taste. So it's a very interesting adaptation to being able to explore flowers. They have ultraviolet to be able to find flowers, and then tasting toes to be able to find out exactly where what you're looking for, the nectaries and the anthers, where they are. It's very, very cool. Bees are highly, highly sensitive, and again, very exploratory. Some of the bees, like bumblebees, if you look also, are highly manipulative. They just have little claws at the tips of their legs, but you can watch bumblebees, if they're on a complex flower, like a legume flower, they will open it up, like opening an envelope. So eating pollen and nectar, bees feed their offspring. and they feed them little pellets of nectar and pollen mixed together, like the yellow pellets you see in this nest tube, being enjoyed by larval bees as they're beginning to grow and develop towards their metamorphosis into adult bees. Most of what drives bee behavior is the need to provision offspring. If you think about it, that's actually a really important distinction between bees and a small number of other insects. Like in our area, for example, some of the burying beetles, some of our beetles here form family groups and they provision their offspring. They feed them, bring them food. That's actually very unusual. Most insects just lay eggs and leave. Bees are important pollinators to a large extent because they've developed parental care. They build nests, they tend and protect their eggs, and then as the eggs hatch and develop, they feed their offspring. Or in many cases, they just leave a little Christmas package for their offspring with one of these yellow lumps with all the food that each individual larva needs to develop into adulthood. That means that each individual bee is not just eating enough to produce eggs and offspring, but eating enough to be able to leave or bring a package of food to their offspring and feed the offspring until they metamorphose into adults. That means each individual bee is collecting food for itself and a number of offspring, which means it needs to collect much more pollen than as an individual it would ever have to eat. And social bees, that's something really very interesting as well. Social bees have whole families to feed, not just a few offspring, 5 or 6 for a solitary bee that is just raising its own eggs and offspring, but bees that have social groups, hives, where they may collectively be raising dozens or hundreds of offspring together. Social bees, very interesting. Bees, as that second or third slide was indicating, are basically wasps that became herbivorous, that shifted from eating other insects to eating pollen and nectar evolutionarily. And like wasps, many bees are social. They've developed social organization from the caste system of honeybees to the extended family systems of bumblebees. And also some of the sweat bees have social systems which are almost like voluntary associations where groups of females nest in the same area and then share guard duty. So there's a range of social alternatives among the bees, from something very much like the hierarchical organization you see in honeybees, down through extended families and just these transitory annual aggregations of females that cooperate. Very interesting, very characteristic of the bees and their ancestral wasps. But despite the fact that bees, like wasps, have developed very complex social systems, at least in some families, the bees as a whole are solitary livers. Most of them live solitary lives, with each female being her own queen, with her own nest or a few nests, which are just little tunnels or small openings where she has enough room to lay several eggs and provide food for offspring that she can, in most cases, tend herself over the winter, over the first winter, so that she stays with her offspring and makes sure that they're safe until they can emerge as adults the following year. So what we call solitary bees, individual queens, living alone with their own offspring, is the norm. even though we tend to think of bees very much around honeybees, which are all the way at the other end of the sociological spectrum, where they're living in very large caste-oriented groups with castes that do different things. So solitary bees, maybe 90% of the bees, all those species that I was talking about, are solitary. But to think about that, that is really important too, because it means that you may not see them very easily, that they could be present in your garden, living in the stem of a raspberry cane, or in the ground between some of your crop rows, or in underneath a shrub, and you might never know that they were there. Unlike, say, a bumblebee family, where you'll see them coming and going, or a big nest of domestic honeybees. Solitary bees, many families, many species, but what distinguishes them, and the way I'll talk about them, is what they use to build their nests. And it's even more, it's not just what they use to build their nests, because most of their nests are just a hole in a tree trunk or an old log or a burrow in the ground that just looks like somebody pushed a pencil into the earth, just a narrow tunnel. It's how they waterproof their nests that distinguishes different bee families, different solitary bee families. So this is a problem. If you build a nest, you have it full of your little offspring, your little larvae, and little pellets of nectar and pollen. What happens over the winter as the larvae are developing, and it rains? You might have your larvae drown by having tunnel nests swamped with water. So all the bees have some way of waterproofing their nests. If you're familiar with honeybees or bumblebees, they use wax. They actually make wax chambers. But the solitary bees use other materials, as strange sometimes as polyester. The cellophane bees are so called because they actually secrete polyester and lick it onto the walls of their tunnels. Wool carder bees, Anthidium, the genus Anthidium is the wool carder that we have in our area, comb the little hairs off of leaves and weave them into textiles and put curtains up, basically, in their tunnels. Here, actually, so up there, that is a wool carder bee, an Anthidium in the upper left, and then a leaf cutter bee. Come back to them in just a little bit. They're really interesting. That either use rolled up leaves or little tiles chewed out of leaves and then plastered like bathroom tiles. And so there were all these possibilities for waterproofing a nest. And much of what distinguishes different families of solitary bees is not the physical structure, the anatomy of the adult, but the behavior of how they waterproof their nests and make them winterized. Very, very cool. So let's drill into our local situation. We have a very large diversity of bees locally. Again, 566 species in Washington state, over 200 species of bees recorded in the Salish Sea region. And this is mostly research that's been done around the Seattle area and the Victoria capital region. And then at least 91 species of bees that I have been able to identify here so far in the Salmon Islands. So as we get more locally, with local wildflowers, local weather conditions, we end up with subsets of those thousands of bee species that are locally adapted And among other things, that get the resources they need to build nice waterproof tunnels and to find the floral resources that they have learned to use to feed their offspring. Notice that in this one, and you might make a mental marker of that, the bumblebees and the minor bees, the Andrenidae, are two of the largest groups in terms of species richness. We have at least 9 common and readily visible bumblebee species, more like 15 altogether, and about 40 species of minor bees. So it's not like that's a minor bee. That's like, well, it could be one of maybe 40 just here on Orcas Island. So species richness, significant within families, and particularly we see thriving and very critical to pollination services here in the Salmon Islands are the minor bees and the bumblebees. And we'll take a closer look at them in just a moment. This is one of the bees you should get to know. This is one of the minor bees, one of the Andrenidae, Andrena vicina. And the reason that I wanted to introduce you to local bee species using this particular bee is that it's one of the first bees to emerge in the spring. They are ground nesters. They are early pollinators of our very early native wildflowers. And you can tell Andrena, you can tell this group of related species by their, I call them backpacks. If you look at it, they've got a fuzzy thorax and it looks like they're wearing a little fuzzy backpack. That's very distinctive of most of the minor bees, that most of their fuzz is on the back of the thorax and it forms a very distinctive patch, which also means behaviorally what they do is they rub themselves, they rub their backs on the anthers as they pick pollen up in flowers. Minor bees are very tough, very versatile, relatively strong flyers. And in one of the study sites that the study site I took this picture in, which was actually American Camp over on San Juan Island, they are doing most of the first 2 weeks or so of pollination in the native wildflower meadows there. Bumblebees. You've probably seen this one, bright yellow, one of our native bumblebees. Bumblebees are the other group that can emerge very early because they have an ability to operate at somewhat lower temperatures than most other bees, and they can shiver. There's something that you can see honeybees do too, and it's particular to the Apidae, that family, is they'll wake up as it starts to warm up, and then they shiver the way, if you've ever done that, like that, and then you warm up. You can feel it right away. Bumblebees do that too. So they'll be in the air sometimes weeks before other bees because of their ability to function in somewhat colder temperatures and to shiver themselves awake, to shiver themselves into enough warmth that they can begin to fly. Further, this particular bumblebee species is one that you might see later, early summer, that again is brilliant yellow. And we have several quite strongly yellow colored native bumblebees here. This is another one you've almost certainly seen here on Orcas, very widespread. It's sometimes called yellow-headed bumblebee. It's almost all velvety black, very beautiful velvety black with a white to yellow face patch. Entomologists call it a Vozzie bear because its scientific name named for a Russian biologist, Voznesensky. So Bombus Voznesensky is a Vozzie bear for most of us that look at bees. And they're interesting not only because they're good, tough pollinators, but because they're expanding their range for reasons that we don't really understand. They started out relatively scarce here in the islands and throughout the Salish Sea, and their numbers and their Their distribution has been increasing steadily for at least the last 15 or 20 years. So they are a successful growing part of our pollinator community that has taken the place of some of the bumblebee species that have pretty much disappeared from the Pacific Northwest in the last 50 to 100 years. Kind of thing that we don't know an awful lot about is competition among bees. Bees are not terribly aggressive to each other. They will companionably share flowers with each other, but they have different capabilities. This is why they speciated, why they formed different species, different behaviors, different preferences. And as we experience climate change, we're beginning to see shifts in which bee species are most successful. And this is a beautiful, very conspicuous example of it in our area. Now, here's a bee that is often mistaken for a bumblebee. We've noticed that in many gardens, people think that they are getting lots of bumblebees in their flowers, and on a closer look, at least half of them are actually so-called digger bees. This group of bees are closely related to bumblebees and to honeybees. They're in the same family, the Apidae. But they're solitary bees. They don't form hives. They form aggregations. But they also don't cooperate. They pretty much just, as every queen is a queen in her own right. But they mimic bumblebees, even to the point that the species that we have here, family is Anthrophora bomboides. Bomboides means bumblebee-like. They end up mimicking the colors of the bumblebees that live in their neighborhood, like chameleons. So they really look like bumblebees because they're perfectly matched to the color patterns of the bumblebees that live in the same area and visit the same flowers. But you can see some interesting differences. Just notice the eyes are very large and they're closer together than in bumblebees. They're quite stocky, and the butt is not hairy. They have a bare butt. They also have a really cool behavior. Anthrophora are tunnel nesters. They nest in the islands in coastal bluffs. So there's nice pale colored, beige and white colored, soft sandy bluffs that are exposed. Many places along the shorelines of San Juan County are often riddled with Anthrophora nests, little tiny holes. And if you go out and walk underneath those bluffs and look carefully in June or July, you may see hundreds to thousands of bees going in and out of those little holes. Now, they just don't drill a hole into the sandy bluff. They plaster it, and then they plug it with a little ball of plaster. It's mud. And the way they get that is they go to beach seeps, gather mouthfuls of wet mud, and then spit it into the nest. And when they seal up the nest, spit a little plug of it into the nest, which means that when they're actively building nests, they're visiting these beach seeps to get the mud very frequently. And you can see in some beach seeps, hundreds of them piling up and greedily grabbing mouthfuls of mud, but completely ignoring each other. They're, again, not social. They just aggregate around the right kinds of bluffs with the right kinds of muddy beaches. Very cool. And we think at this point that they are doing up to 50% of the work that is attributed to bumblebees in the San Juan Islands. Again, because they get misidentified. And bumblebees are a major part of our pollinator community, of our pollinator services. But increasingly, we're seeing that when people report bumblebees, they're actually seeing bees. very, very beautiful. That's our native wool carder bee. And that's got a very wasp-like shiny abdomen. They are quite rare. They generally are seen along shorelines in gumweed, like here. And they are territorial. All the Anthidiums, all the wool carder bees are territorial. The male will defend a flower and sit there and wait for females to grab. And we've actually filmed this. They'll wait, and when a female comes, the male will immediately try to mate with her. But if any other males come by, he will attack them. So that in a field of gumweed along the shoreline, you could have a dozen flowers that are being defended by male Anthidium. If you approach, they'll buzz you. They won't do any harm, but they'll basically challenge you. And any other insect that flies near their flowers, they will attack. We have a invasive European Anthidium, Anthidium manicatum, which has yellow and black on its abdomen. And they are moving into gardens. We have seen them in gardens throughout San Juan County. They are extremely aggressive, even to people. They will attack native bees, and they scare them off by imitating what a wasp will do. They will grab them, grab the intruding bee and shake it, and then let it go, which is, from the point of view of the Greek bee that's grabbed, it's like this terrible wasp hiding in this flower, and I'm not gonna come anywhere near it. So the male Anthidium are hanging out. I've seen this actually right downtown in East Sound here. There'll be Anthidium hanging out in flowers, and as another bee goes by, they'll rise up out of the flowers and attack them, grab them. And then, so very interesting, very aggressive behavior. They're the only bees that we have, the only true bees that we have that are territorial in that sense of males defending flowers that they use as their love nests. Now, Anthidium are interesting, just to show how bees are connected to each other in interesting ways. Most bees have at least one specific kleptoparasite, that is to say, one bee that has gone bad, that eats the offspring of other bees and steals their nests. Cuckoo bees, they're sometimes called, for obvious reasons. Cuckoo bees mimic the color patterns of the bees they prey on, so that they are not necessarily noticed when they climb into the nests they intend to parasitize. But they typically, if you look at it, you see the thorax is very muscular. Here, let me go back to look at that thorax. Nice little dainty thorax, of course, where the legs are all connected. But then look at the kleptoparasite. See? Yeah, and that's because what they do is they will climb into a tunnel nest, start eating killing and eating the larval bees that are in there. The queen, the mother, may come and try to defend her nest and pull the kleptoparasite out. But it holds itself in with those shoulders. And many kleptoparasites, including these, the epiolids, have horns on their shoulders to lock themselves in so they can't be pulled out while they're eating the offspring. So this is something very, very interesting and a little terrifying to watch in wild bee communities. And you will find within any natural wild bee community that there are kleptoparasites that are, again, specifically linked by matching color patterns to particular native bees. And again, there's the bees that have gone bad, and they disguise themselves to go and invade and take over the nests of true bees, of bees that are pollinators rather than parasites. Sweat bees, very interesting group, poorly named. supposedly these are bees that like to lick salty sweat off of people, but they don't. So it's an old, it's an old label that doesn't really tell you very much. But sweat bees are typically like this one. They have a very nice, shiny, dark, black and white banded abdomen. And you can tell them apart from other bees by which ways up or down the hairs on the edge of the abdomen go. But look at all the bristles on the legs. They are always packing pollen on their legs and using those legs to carry significant amounts of pollen around to the point of the bee looking like just a ball of pollen. One other thing to notice in this photograph, because it's a nice close one, do you see what's on the top of the head? There's little bumps.
Yes.
There are 3. Those are ocelli. Those are their eyes. They're simple eyes. So a bee has 2 compound eyes and 3 simple eyes. And the ocelli are very important with bees because when a bee is busy inside a flower, chewing on the anthers and lapping up pollen, if something comes down over it, which could be a wasp, a predator, they can see the shadows without moving their head. They don't have to look up because the top of their head has these 3 little light sensitive eyes in them, but it don't have a complex lens system. So it just detects movement and shadow above the bee. That's very interesting. So you see with many bees, they'll be working in a flower and another bee will come and the other bee doesn't have to aggressively attack them. Simply the fact that something is descending over them will make them scoot because they immediately detect that there's something above them that's approaching. This is one of our prettiest native bees, longhorn bees. They are not only beautifully fuzzy and have nice green eyes, but the males have these very long antennae, which are analogous to the antenna of male moths. Their function is to smell the females. If you're a solitary bee, what do boys do? The queens are individual. They meet the boys on flowers. And the boys tend to sleep in flowers because they have no nests. But it's very important to be able to find each other. And with the longhorn bees, the sense of smell is amplified with these exceptionally long antennae on the male. And again, like in moths, this is sexually dimorphic. This is a male characteristic. The female has normal antennae. These are very cute. Melicides are very, very pretty little bees in our wild environments. This is a leafcutter bee. If you look around the edges of the abdomen, you'll see the orange yellow color of the pollen that's stuck to her belly. She's going to groom herself and pack the pollen on her belly. Notice also, this is a megachillid. The megachillids are one of the families of bees. We have a number of them here. Megachillid. Megachillid implies stout. And if you look at this bee, you can see they're very broad. Most of our bee families are slim. Megachillids are kind of stout, hence their name. And many of the megachillids pack pollen on their abdomen rather than packing it on their legs, like most bees. And these guys are very important, but they get mistaken for ants because they're small and black. And you look in a flower and there's this little black thing in there crawling around in the flower that for all the world is a little black ant, but it's actually a little bee. We have several different families of bees that look like this, but this is our most common and important one, the Serratinas, little tiny black bees as small as 1/8 of an inch, but mostly closer to a quarter of an inch, that are the bees that drill holes in raspberry canes and other cane fruit canes and build their tunnel nests in the gutta percha, in the soft center of old canes. It's a very good reason not to cut all your old canes all the way back and to take a look at them for little entry holes before you remove them, because you may have the bees pollinating your cane fruit living in your canes rather than coming from somewhere else. And if you're too, if you clean up too much, you may actually eliminate your pollinators. One last one, my favorite, Agapostemon. Sorry, it's just been renamed, and there's a huge controversy in the bee taxonomic world about their genus name, but I'm using the old one that we've used for about 100 years so far. Male and female, slightly different. See, the male has a yellow and black abdomen. The female is green all the way on to very, very bright green. They have, by the way, a kleptoparasite bee that looks exactly the same. That's bright green, but you'll see it hanging around doing what kleptoparasite bees do, which is instead of nectaring and eating pollen and packing pollen, what they do is they hang around, and when they see other bees, they try to follow them back to their nests. But Agapostemons, all of our wildlands and gardens that are close to wildlands around San Juan County will be visited by them sometime. They're long season bees. They emerge as early as March and they're around until September or October. And very, very hard to miss, but frequently mistaken for wasps because they look metallic and strange and wasp-like. One more thought here. This is a creature that is particularly fascinating. The nomadas are the bees that really went really bad. These are the true bandit bees that have become generalist predators. And so this is the end, the way in which evolution sometimes circles around and repeats itself. The ancestors of bees were wasps that were predators. Bees are herbivores, pollen and nectar eaters. There's also this group of nomadas, which have now evolved into predators. And you'll often see nomadas almost running transects over the ground, 6-7 inches off the ground. They're not going into nests. You don't see them to fly over and go into their own nest. You see them scanning like this, and they'll fly and fly and fly until they smell a bee nest and then go down and eat the larva. So they've become sort of the lions or tigers of the bee world, and they're just a bee that has gone full circle around to becoming a predator again. Typically, we have a few species. The taxonomy of nomadas is still in dispute, but we have at least 2 species here, and they're characterized by this brick red color, strong thorax. And when you look at them, they're slightly fuzzy. They do pollinate because they are slightly fuzzy, but they don't have any of the specialized pollen collection devices like Scopy or Pedicula because they eat other bees. Before we leave it, this is not a bee, it's a wasp. It looks very wasp-like. It is very wasp-like. It is a member of the wasp group that bees evolved from that has also become bee-like. So it's a sort of ancestral wasp that has now become somewhat more like a bee, Bembex, associated with sand dunes and sandy areas, distinctive, very bright green eyes. They're quite big. They scare the dickens out of people very often, but they're very gentle. An entomologist that we had working with us at one point to demonstrate it actually went and took a nap lying down on top of an area that had about 50 Bembex nests in it. And they were walking all over her and flying back and forth and paying no attention whatsoever. Bembex are really interesting because the adults behave like bees and they eat pollen and nectar. And you'll see them nectaring, eating pollen and flowers, and they pollinate very nicely because you can see they're very fuzzy. But to feed their larvae, they don't feed their larvae nectar and pollen. They're still partly wasp-like. So what they do is they kill flies and feed the flies to their offspring. So the larval bembex, the larval sand wasps are carnivorous, but they evolve into nectar and pollen eating adults, herbivorous adults. Very cool. So watch out for them because they are really beautiful. They do scare people. They really look, people are sure they're yellow jackets. Absolutely harmless, very, very neat, and very good pollinators. Okay, so what do we have to think about in terms of the future of pollination? Bees actually represent about half of the pollinator services that we depend upon here in the islands. Flies make up almost the other half, and that's where we're going to go next. Is a brief review of the role of flies in pollination. But most of the pollinator services here in the islands is insects, not moths and butterflies as people think. They are very, very marginal. And most of the butterflies that we have here in the islands are long-tongued butterflies. They have long tongues like hummingbirds. And what they do is they sit discreetly on the edge of a flower and stick their tongue in, so they never touch the anthers. Hummingbirds, yeah, red flowering currant, other trumpet-shaped flowers. We have some flowers that are hummingbird pollinated, but 90% of what's going on pollination-wise here in the islands is almost evenly divided between bees and flies. And we're going to come back to the flies in a moment. But first, what are the threats? Well, on a global scale, there are two things that are at this stage clearly resulting in a reduction in the abundance and species diversity of bees. Pesticides, number one, pesticides and herbicides. And the second thing is domestic bees, because domestic bees, honeybees, in large enough numbers, and if not properly cared for, are vectors of disease to wild bees. So it's just like livestock. If you are a crappy rancher and your animals are sick, they are going to pass diseases and parasites on to each other and potentially to wildlife. But here's the big threat to all pollinators, and sort of my transition from bees to flies. What's happening to our weather patterns? Classic weather pattern here. Here's, classic Northwest based on instruments in Seattle, where the red line is the temperature curve and the blue is the mean precipitation rainfall from month to month. And most of our native plants tend to flower between March and June. So our native plant pollinator picture is not the whole summer growing season that gardeners think of, but just that early spring, March to June. Most of our native wildflowers have finished up by June, and they are taking advantage of the sweet spot where it's still a bit wet and the temperature is getting warmer and the days are getting longer. Now, what's happening is the temperature is going up. The precip is happening more earlier, like it is now, and the growing season is getting shorter for native plants. Compressed growing season, we're seeing the period of blooming of native wildflowers here in the islands contracting from about 8 weeks to about 4 weeks at this point, which is a really, really dramatic change. And this is a challenge for pollinators, along with what we're experiencing right now. More windstorms, stormier winters, more winter precipitation, and then drier, hotter summers. But the storminess, the wind, and rain combined are a big challenge for animals that fly. Now, the problem for gardeners is that some of the things that we are growing basically overlay with the native wildflower season. For example, our fruit trees, most of which are trying to get pollinated in March and April, and maybe, some of them a little later, apples, plums and cherries, right smack there at the beginning of the native wildflower season. And so, along with native wildflowers, many of our garden plants, particularly our orchards, are overlain with this shrinking period of time when the precipitation and the temperature are just right. But nowadays, it's getting windier and stormier during that window of time. If you're a bee, sleeping with your offspring in a little tunnel like this, you're basically responding to soil temperature, and as it warms up, you emerge. You can't see the sunlight, and you can't really sense the water because you're living in your nice little waterproof tunnel. But as the soil around you warms up, you hit a point, that's it, time to emerge. And increasingly, bees are hitting that and emerging in the middle of something like we've had the last 24 hours, except in March or April. This is a model, an aerodynamic model of insect flying to get us thinking about the fact that if you're an insect, like an airplane, there are conditions under which you can fly and conditions under which you can't. And as wind and rain intensify, most insects reach a point that they can't fly anymore. They're grounded. If you're a bee, that's really bad because not only might it mean that you starve, but that you can't reproduce because you can't provision your nest for your offspring. Having cooler, wetter, stormier springs is really bad for bees. And the reason is that bees have a relatively narrow margin of the right balance, the optimal balance of energy consumption and lift. So bees are like a big cargo plane that can lift an enormous amount of mass, but uses up a huge amount of fuel to do it. Flies, interestingly, are much more efficient. They can lift less mass per fly, but they also use far less energy to do it. So they're like the fighter planes that just roar around very, very, very fast, but efficient in the sense that for every, let's talk pollen grains, for every pollen grain, the amount of fuel used, the amount of energy used to carry it around is much less. So bees collect more pollen, they can lift and transport more pollen, but because they have to use a lot of energy to do it, it doesn't take very bad weather conditions to ground. But flies, flies are more efficient flyers. They have all sorts of interesting adaptations to that. The insect picture, it shows flies have wing tabs. They have weird anatomical adaptations to enable them to do things like fly upside down, take off vertically, things that bees can't ever do, and to do it with less energy. So where do flies actually fit into this? You would think it would be very convenient if flies were good pollinators because they can operate in the kinds of stormier springtime weather that's becoming the norm here in the Northwest. Well, flies do pollinate. That's a fly just emerged from a chocolate lily down at the national park, totally covered with pollen. flies do pick up pollen when they nectar. They don't all eat pollen. The typical fly, most flies of the thousands of fly species that are around, lap nectar as fuel. They'll refuel by visiting flowers and drinking nectar. And as they do it, they will pick up some pollen, and it depends on the particular family of fly and how fuzzy they are and their behavior, whether they pick up 2 or 3 grains of pollen or 20 or 30 grains of pollen. One of the things that is also a problem with flies is that flies do not provision nests. They're not looking for pollen. And so they're not paying attention to which flowers have ripe pollen on them, as long as the flowers have some nectar. So flies often deliver pollen to the wrong address. A bumblebee will be part of an extended family, and she and her sisters will go and they will, as a team, go out and work a patch of flowers, sometimes for 2 weeks, until they've got all the pollen out of it, and they're spending all of their time visiting the same species of flower and transporting pollen within that patch of flowers. So they're very, very good, reliable messengers or postmistresses that are taking up pollen and delivering it almost all to the correct address, other flowers of the same species. The flies are like postmistresses on, intoxicated, bumbling around. They'll go into one kind of flower and they'll drink some nectar, and an hour later they'll visit a different species of flower and drop off some pollen from the first flower. So very inefficient. They're not targeting, they're not, as we say, faithful. On the other hand, there are lots of flies. And in studies done recently in Europe by European community universities, they have found that simply because of their number, flies in Europe are doing about half of the pollinator services. That half of the pollen is delivered to the right flowers is delivered by a fly, even though most of the pollen that flies pick up go to the wrong flower. So it's a statistical game. Bees, very, very faithful. Almost all the pollen they collect goes right to the right flowers. Flies are delivering stuff all over the place, but by sheer chance, there are so many of them, they end up doing a lot of pollinating. So interesting. And then the story gets better, because there's one group of flies, the Syrphidae, sometimes called flower flies or hoverflies because of their flight behavior, that are unusual among flies because they will eat pollen. They don't provision nests. They don't have nests. They just lay their eggs like other insects and fly away. But they are long-lived. Most Syrphidae live for several weeks to several months, and they will migrate to where there are flowers. So they're more mobile than bees are. And because they eat pollen, they are very careful about visiting only flowers that are producing ripe pollen. It gets even better. But first of all, one thing to note is that many of the flower flies have fuzziness. And it's very strategic fuzziness. It's on their face and on the back of the thorax. So it's the parts of the fly that get stuffed into the flower when they drink. So you can see, as soon as you look at a flower fly, you see that the front end, which goes into the flower when they drink nectar and eat pollen, it has some fuzz on it, although it's very fine velvety fuzz compared to bees. And the back end, which doesn't go into the flower, is usually completely bare, completely shiny and bare. Now, here's the thing that you gardeners should really be excited about, is this sort of like the Bembex story, where the larvae are carnivorous. Flies, like the sand wasps, basically feed aphids to their offspring. Though they don't really, because they don't really take care of them. They'll lay their eggs where there are aphid infestations. And the larval flower flies, as they hatch into these little caterpillar-like larval flower flies, as they hatch, they feast on the aphids. So if a flower fly visits your aphid-infested plants in your garden, should be very happy because the offspring will eat the aphids and then turn into mature flower flies that will pollinate your flowers. This is a really interesting group, and it's been totally ignored in discussions of pollination in garden management. We have loads of syrphid fly species in our area, over 150 in the Salmon Islands. And if you watch flowers in, let's say, less managed areas, unmanaged old fields, or wildflower fields, you may see them do half or more of the flower visitation, but they typically don't get any attention because people will say, oh, it's just a fly, not a bee. Well, if it's a flower fly, it's there for a purpose and it is likely to pass some pollen on. And the worst that can happen is it just leaves some eggs behind wherever it finds some aphids and has the aphids destroyed as a result. Flower flies are very complicated in that there are some that are very, very shiny, if you were, very wasp-like, like this parasurface on the left. And if you look at parasurface under a microscope, you'll see that its face is completely covered with very, very fine hair to pick up pollen, but it's not something, what we see is we just see the shininess, not the fine pollen catching hair. And then some flower flies that are fuzzy, like the prairie rhino over there, that's a bumblebee mimic. All flower flies mimic bees and wasps, and that's the way they avoid predators. Predator approaches, sees something in a flower, decides to eat it, and then takes a closer look and, oh, it looks like a wasp. I'll go somewhere else. So mimicking bees and wasps is the protective coloration of flower flies, but also very often involves having fuzziness that not only mimics the appearance of bees, but also has the same function as the hairiness on bees. How do you tell flies and bees apart? Quick example. The first thing is flies have big eyes. Most of the head is eyes. The eyes make up 90% of the face. On bees, the eyes are relatively small, but bees have mandibles, jaws that are toothed and are designed for chewing anthers, whereas flies have little tongues, like cat tongues for lapping. So if you look closely, if it's got jaws, then it's probably a bee. If it's got big round eyes, it's probably a fly. And if you look more closely, you'll see that the fly, rather than chewing, is lapping. Also, flies have little tiny antenna. Bees have tubular, long tubular. Remember, the antenna are used to touch and taste. Flies don't do that. They have little tiny antenna that look like two little tiny fingers. Very, very sensitive for sampling the air. They're sniffing, but they do not touch to taste. So their senses are different, and anatomically, you can see that. That's about lapping. That's why they like flowers they can walk on. They can actually hover and eat, like eat an anther, like this little skiva is doing, without actually landing on it, just hovering, which is incredibly cool to watch. Interestingly, we have invasive flower flies from Europe, but they fit right in because flower flies they're hugely numerous. They They don't, they're non-territorial. And so mixed in with our native flower flies are European flower flies that also pollinate, and they do not detract from the overall function of flower flies. Flower flies also have their parasites. They're these beautiful bee flies that you see buzzing around in the garden. These are actually parasites, not they, but they pollinate. Look, this one has covered those little dots on it. That's pollinate. They drink nectar to fuel their flights to go and parasitize the nests of bees. Okay, flower flies. What are the threats to flower flies as pollinators? Well, pesticides again. Chemical applications, not good. They are very sensitive and frequently mistaken for destructive insects. So it's not uncommon for flower fly populations to be targeted for pesticides. As we talked about before, with the bees, we're concerned about sharing flowers and passing things back and forth. Broadly speaking, that's an issue for flower flies as well. And being too neat, cleaning up gardens, taking out debris, woody debris, having everything planted, making too neat a garden, bad for bees and bad for flies. Let's take a look at that in a moment, but that's really one of the major concerns from a garden management point of view, is if you're too neat and you get rid of things like puddles and a little bit of rotting wood and a log that's sitting somewhere, some shrubbery around an old tree. Too neat means no habitat for flies to lay eggs and for bees to dig nests. The bottom line of all of this is that as the climate changes, it becomes increasingly important to attract pollinators to your garden, not just to pass through, but to nest. If you can get bees, native bees, nesting in your garden, they have a shorter distance to fly to your flowers, and they will be less affected, less deterred by weather conditions. If the serratinas, for example, are already nesting in some of your cane fruit, your rubus pollinators are already there in the garden. All they have to do is climb up the canes. And so the impact of stormy or spring weather is much lower on gardens that have bees nesting in them. Also, if you have lots of different kinds of pollinators, lots of different species, they will emerge at different times between spring and fall. So you get plenty of pollination at different times of year with different groups of plants. And that means that you have a better fit between a garden that is blooming over a long period of time and pollinators that are emerging and taking advantage of that and helping over a long period of time. Also, if you've got your own pollinators living in your garden, it kind of insulates you from neighbors that may not be as careful about things like pesticides. If you depend on long distance flyers, on bees being somewhere in the neighborhood, and they'll come visit you too, you not only are dealing with the possibility that the bees won't make it because of weather, but also dealing with the possibility that somebody else is going to go and spray, and that the pollinators that you need are going to die or be sickened somewhere else in the neighborhood. This is the kind of stuff, this is where bees hang out in gardens. Sapsucker holes, beetle holes in wood, brushy areas. That's a bumblebee nest. Actually, there is a huge bumblebee nest underneath those rocks. Rock piles, brush piles, old down snaggy wood, all good bee nesting, and many of the flower flies will use those as well, particularly if they're moist. leafcutter bees. If you see plants like that, don't get upset. That means you have a leafcutter bee, or maybe several. That's taking the tiles out of the leaves. I know a lot of people, when they see that, they start spraying, and they're killing the bees that have just moved into their garden. And don't do this. There's a lot of promotion, unfortunately, some university ag extension programs that shall go unnamed promote these things. The big problem with using essentially domestic bees or building bee hotels and creating big artificial bee colonies is that dense collections of unmanaged bees tend to be sinks for viruses and parasites. So that if you do this, you may be getting a short-term advantage in terms of more bees, but a longer-term disadvantage in terms of spreading disease and parasites to the wild bees that already exist all around you. Not a good idea. And these are two problems that we have right now. Houdini fly, which is a parasite. If you have mason bees, that's a serious concern, although careful mason bee growers know how to break open the tubes and look for Houdini fly larvae in them. But you don't need to do all of that if you just have nesting habitat for wild bees that already live there. Deformed wing virus, very, very bad, and that's being transmitted by honeybees to wild bumblebees now, which is a big concern. So this is a meme I like about that. You know, this is no bee hotels. Just don't be too neat in your garden. Leave a messy garden. Leave places that bees like to hang out. So, bottom line, I would say, is that we need to be talking more about inviting wild bees into gardens, giving them nesting habitat, safe nesting habitat, no pesticides, recognizing flower flies' importance, not interfering with flower flies in the garden, so it's mostly chemical too, and ultimately also being very careful that if you have moist areas, puddles, water features, recognize that other than being sometimes attractive or maybe having tree frogs move in or things like that, that's where a lot of your hoverflies are going to lay their eggs. And if you have aphid infestations, check them out and see if flower flies have laid eggs on them, because then you don't have to worry about them. And I think we can live better into the future by taking those steps to have every garden be an ecosystem with its own pollinator community, rather than relying on things like honeybee hives and mason bees and spraying everything that moves that unfortunately has been inculcated in gardeners for many years as a solution for things. Thank you for your attention. And just to add my commercial message briefly again, the last thing, we've got a project called Footprint, which is to determine how far the impacts of pesticide use go, because when you spray an aerosol, it drifts, it lands on non-target insects, non-target vegetation. The insects that just get a small dose don't die, but then the insectivores, the animals that eat insects, eat poisoned insects, and eventually they get poisoned themselves. That includes many birds, many reptiles, and bats. What we're trying to do is raise enough funds to do a study on orcas of where pesticide residues have worked their way into the wildlife around here, like bats and birds, and basically just raising funds for the lab work that we need to do. We have kids go and collect the specimens. It'll be in the holiday catalog when the Community Foundation breaks it out, and introduce Christian Oldham, who's our coordinator here on Orcas Island, who will be the lead on that project. He's our herpetologist as well, so very familiar with the reptiles and amphibians on the island, which will be a major target of our concern because they eat insects, including, we fear, a lot of insects that have been poisoned or contaminated by pesticide use. So that's something that we can start doing now. And actually, if everyone in this room donated, 10 or 20 bucks to the fundraiser, we'd have enough to pay for all the lab work, and we could do it. Just to get a better sense of what the costs and benefits of pesticides over the counter, the stuff you get at Ace Hardware in town or out at Island Hardware, how far does that stuff go after you spray it? What's the collateral damage? And we can sort of theorize and hypothesize about that, but we'd like to actually know so that we understand fully what the consequences of those are. Anyway, thank you so much for your patience. And yes,
Can
Questions?
you hear me?
yes.
Right, okay. So, thank you, Russell. I learned so much about bees. And I guess one question I have that is, so you talked about so many different types. Would you recommend a phone app or another type of resource that you can use in your garden to try and identify these wonderful creatures?
Two things that I can suggest. We have a website. Unfortunately, we're now rebuilding it after Google went and moved it to a different platform, and much of it disappeared. But if you look for native pollinators of the San Juan Islands, you will find a Quiot website, which, if you'll excuse us for not having beautiful background photography, which Google lost, and we're slowly replacing, has photos and bios of about 100 local hoverflies and bees that you can look at it. It'll tell you where we see it, what flowers it likes, what we know about it in the local environment. So our website, Samwhat, you can just look at it as SJI pollinators as a single word, and Google will get you there. There's an excellent book called Backyard Bees that is a compendium of material on bees of North America, including the major groups we have here, and is by far the best guide because it's systematic. It works family by family. It really shows you what to look at on bees. It's not just a big catalog like a field guide where you look at a picture and you look at a bee. It's teaching you how to understand the anatomy and behavior of each family of bees with beautiful photos. So if you'd like to treat yourself for the holidays, I would say get a copy of that, Backyard Bees, and start working your way through it, because you'll suddenly start recognizing things in your garden.
Fantastic, great. Do we have any questions in the room?
This is a short honeybee question. Originally, you said something about most honeybees are a result of hybridization.
Yes.
Cultivation. I've read that, like in Pharaoh's tombs and stuff, they found honey. Is that a result of Egyptian beekeepers 3,000 years ago keeping hives? Or
That's a great question. There's some dispute now about when people began to actually cultivate hives. People were collecting honey from wild hives where honeybees come from in North Africa and the Middle East. So we know that people were eating honey and collecting honey, and there were cave paintings of people doing that going back, 10,000 years. But sometime probably around 3,000 years ago, about the time of the establishment of the Babylonian and Egyptian empires, people began to actually cultivate bees. And that is, so it's very ancient. and goes back to the same period of time that people learned how to raise cattle and goats. So bees have been a part of Mediterranean agriculture and agricultural civilization for several thousand years, but were introduced to North America in the 17th century.
Yeah.
And since then, of course, have spread because people want to make honey. And the trade-off is if you make honey, what we're recommending to to people in the islands that are interested in making honey is to have your hives in an area that you can plant with wild, native, resilient plants like snowberry that honeybees adore, and actually build the floral resources for your bees so they don't have to go very far, rather than having your bees go and visit your neighbor's property and potentially impact the lives of their wild bees, which is very unfair and it's bad ecology. So, and we've been struggling with this. USDA keeps a register of where certified honeybees go. We found that there are something in the order of 30 registered honeybee beekeepers in the islands, and then many who have not registered and are not using certified bees, clean bees. And you know how many people sell honey in the islands actually have commercial hives? One of them's my father-in-law. So I come from a beekeeping family here, and that's really been a concern. We actually have had a couple of beekeepers drop out of the commercial business because their bees were hybridizing with uncertified sort of feral honeybees out there that had escaped from unregistered hives and were diseased and deformed. So it's not even good for honey production to just go and put hives everywhere to, to help pollination. Bad for wild bees, and it's actually bad for actual commercial beekeepers who are trying to keep their hives free of viruses and parasites and free of unplanned mating with who knows what honeybee combinations are out there. It's very interesting. There are two major strains of honeybees that we have here in the Pacific Northwest, what people call Italian bees and African bees. And the Italians are very gentle, very sweet, you pick them up there. And the Africans will sting you. The two different strains, but the African bees produce more honey. So most serious beekeepers have done controlled hybridization of these two strains of Mediterranean honeybees. But then when the bees go out, they're going to encounter and share flowers with whatever other honeybees are around. And yeah, we had one commercial beekeeper basically pretty much wiped out by bees coming back with loads of parasites and viruses. So again, like domestic livestock, if you're interested in producing milk, you don't go and buy some cattle and let them loose in your neighbor's fields. And that's essentially what happens, unfortunately, if people think that they're saving the pollinators by bringing in unmanaged hives. Also, colony collapse. There's been a big thing about colony collapse. USDA has found that most of the reports of colony collapse are people who bought hives and lost the bees in the first winter because they didn't feed them. They didn't know they had to. So it's inflated the colony collapse statistics enormously. And the highest colony collapse rates are in states where they have the largest numbers of basically small, privately owned, non-honey producing hives. So yeah, that's great. There's a whole story of civilization in honey.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we have one other question here.
Two questions.
Yes.
Do you know anything about the impact of deer repellent spray?
Oh,
on
interesting.
insects? And also the interaction with yellow jackets and what happened to them last summer?
Okay.
And on.
Yeah. Very interesting. I don't have a confident answer to your first question. I haven't read or seen any evidence of deer repellents having any adverse impact on bees. The active ingredients that I'm familiar with in deer repellents, I haven't looked at all of them, but the active ingredients I do know should not affect bees. And second question, yeah, that's really interesting. Yellow jackets are predators. They're very much selective in what they eat. They're carnivorous and aggressive, and they like to eat big things. So they're very much linked to what other insects are available to eat. And we noticed that there were a lot of colonies disappeared. Colonies that we had a few years ago have not renewed. Hard to say for sure. The first thing to think of is weather patterns. We've had weird weather this year. All insects are very much affected in flight and their reproductive cycle, their emergence times by weather. But here's a piece of collateral evidence. We just finished analyzing data from our bat recorders. We have acoustic recorders listening to bats at 6 places in San Juan County every night, just automated recorders. And we've now recorded about 1 million bat flyovers in San Juan County since 2016. We just finished a massive data reduction project to see what trends were present at the local and the county-wide level. And there was a big collapse of bat populations in 2022, 2 years ago. One possible explanation for that was a significant decrease in insect populations. And yellow jackets and bats eat the same things. So it's made me wonder at what exactly caused that sudden bat decrease with an insect apocalypse, at least a temporary local insect apocalypse being the explanation that kind of cries out to you. And if that happened, a lot of other species that depend on the same kinds of insects would have suffered between 22 and 23. And climate conditions like extreme flooding in winter, which we have been having recently, could add to that and reduce the survival of wasp colonies. Also, we have to consider the possibility, since we don't have good quantification of wasp population sizes, is that they're going in a cycle like the famous rabbit hare cycle, where predators gobble up their prey and actually eat themselves out of their resources, then have a collapse of population, and then they slowly rebuild and then eat themselves out of prey again. And so there may be a cyclical element to yellow jackets where they expand over a number of years and then hit the ceiling of the available prey. It would be really great to know, because they are a surprisingly big part of our insect ecosystem. And the question you raise is the kind of question that that entomologists and wildlife biologists look at and say, I wish somebody had been collecting data on that, because it opens up a whole bunch of possible connections to other things like bats and other insectivores. So I'm not sure, but yes, I saw the same thing. And we're struggling to figure out what might be the connection between wasp reductions and bat reductions. Anything else?
Any other questions? Nancy?
A quick question, the tent caterpillars.
Yes.
Parasitic wasps and people who normally even wanna do organic, freak out and spray when there's a big tent caterpillar.
Yeah, we now have 2 tent caterpillar species. This last outbreak that we had was both a summer and a fall tent caterpillar. The first layer of the answer is that spraying when you actually see the tent caterpillars emerge is the collateral damage vastly outweighs the impact on the tent caterpillars. It really doesn't make sense that the best thing to do is look for the egg cases when you do your winter spring pruning and grafting, and check all the trees and look for the egg cases, because if you take them off by hand, that fixes the problem. And it's not going to hurt any other creatures. We are not seeing an awful lot of evidence that tent caterpillars are major food for other creatures in the system, probably because they do go in a very strong cycle. So like a lot of other kinds of food resources, you can't evolve into a very healthy species if you have to wait 5 years for your next meal. And so the cyclical nature of tent caterpillars protects them from predators, but also means that they don't serve a major role in the ecosystem that would make us worry about trying to reduce their numbers. So it's sort of the other side of the equation is, well, do they do any good? Well, not so much. We have found, Christian worked on this, we have found that tent caterpillars, that bullfrogs are very fond of them. So we have one invasive species that is very happy to see tent caterpillars in your garden. But that doesn't make us feel any better. The interesting issue though is that they are regulated by the eggs you see them are from a tachnid fly. And this last year when there were so many of them, we were seeing them with 3 or 4 eggs on their heads. It's very nasty. The larva of the fly hatches into the head of the tent caterpillar and eats its little brains out. But that does stop it dead. And so the fly, now that's interesting because then this gets us back to pesticides. If you spray the caterpillars, you're also spraying their parasite. So you're interrupting the natural cycle of control that has kept them in this attenuated cycle where they only get really bad after several years. And that could be, we don't know, because fortunately there hasn't been that much aerosol spraying. But I would worry that too much of an attempt to control tent caterpillars would actually have the opposite effect. So the recommendation that we have from what we're seeing in the environment is remove egg cases, examine trees, remove egg cases. If you start to see a tent, you can try to remove the tent, because if it's on the ground, the developing caterpillars will die. They have to actually reach the point of maturity that they can leave on their own. So breaking open the tent and dumping the caterpillars on the ground early enough may kill most of them. Don't cut branches off because you're just injuring the tree. And don't spray it because you're killing the tachinids. You're killing the parasite that has been regulating these creatures in the environment here for a long time. It's hard. I know our trees at home, one of our favorite trees ended up, covered and it makes you just want to go out and kill every one of them, but not chemically, please, because that will have huge collateral damage.
What should we do with the egg clusters? Just put them on the ground?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just get them off the tree. You can stamp on it. Let it out that way. But yeah, they don't have to be pickled or poisoned or anything like that. The important thing is to stop their development so that they don't actually emerge. And also to be sure to check trees early enough. But yeah.
What do the egg clusters look like?
They were good. It's better to actually see pictures, and I unfortunately don't have one handy. There are plenty of pictures online, but get familiar with them because it looks like somebody put a ring of wax or gum, yeah.
Silver gum.
Silver, that's a good description of it. And it's quite, once you've seen them, they're very conspicuous, which is great. And that will give you a chance to go and intervene. And it's perfect timing if you do tree pruning before the next growing season. That's the time to look for them, when you're up in the tree pruning.
Trisha, I think that's an excellent idea for a newsletter article. So we'll put that in the newsletter.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah,
There's one question that just came up on the Zoom, which might be a good one to end on.
okay, I have one in my hand.
Okay, so.
You're so.
Vala wants to know, back to honeybees, do you have any resources in San Juan County to support responsible and healthy honeybee production hives?
Oh, brother, I wish I had better news. There was an attempt. My father-in-law, Kevin Murphy, and Eric Hall, who were two of the largest, I think probably at that time were the largest honeybee keepers and producers, organized a beekeeper circle, a working group nearly 10 years ago with the idea of having serious beekeepers in the county get together and work together cooperatively to deal with things like deformed wing virus and mite control. And it was very, very cool. But what happened was that it ended up being Kevin and Eric talking to themselves, and there wasn't enough commitment to keep it going. And now we're still in a similar potential situation with a few very serious people and a lot of people that are well-intentioned hobbyists. It would probably be one of the things the Extension Service should do, but WSU is a bit schizophrenic about honeybees, kind of promoting them and at the same time putting out legitimate information on responsible beekeeping. The one thing I can recommend is that both Oregon State University and WSU have courses for beekeepers, both in person and online, that include things like disease recognition, hive management, hive health, that are very worthwhile. And Oregon State in particular has the best courses for learning how to identify all these things, including how to work with a microscope with your bees. And use a microscope to find parasites and mites and things like that. So those courses would be what I would recommend. Now, what I would like to see though, is that we get back to having a serious private nonprofit working group of beekeepers that can coordinate, agree on good practices, keep track of things, and be a very kind and diplomatic elder brother for people who want to get into beekeeping and could talk to local people about that, but it doesn't currently exist.
Thank you.
Okay, and our last question actually came in before your talk from Sandora, and you've already touched on this, so maybe it's a really great way to
Okay.
wrap it up. So for 30 years, she's had a huge population of bees at her home. However, this year, there's been hardly any bees at all.
Oh, yeah.
And they have, plenty of plants.
Yeah,
They've found that, they've had to hand pollinize zucchini, tomatoes, etc. What are the reasons?
yeah.
She doesn't see that there's any local pesticides being used, and what can they do?
Yeah.
To help next season?
So this is, I've observed the same thing at my home. We, for the first time ever, we were out hand pollinating our squash. The same thing. At least from my observations, because I've been counting and identifying bees at home and watching them in wildlands at the same time. We have had an extremely weird weather year. Very stormy spring, which this 2024 spring resulted in very patchy pollination of trees, of fruit trees, which was a bad sign. Patchy in the sense that they either got pollinated or they didn't. And some trees were just dripping fruit and other trees had 2 or 3 apples or pears on them. As an indication that it was highly localized where pollinators were, and that in a large part of the county, pollinator populations just failed this year. They emerged too early and drowned, or they emerged too late, and their familiar floral resources had already bloomed and there was nothing there for them. So weather patterns, _1 culprit for this particular significant decline in pollinator populations and pollinator services in 2024. Hold your breath for 2025. If this continues, if we continue to have such severe, wet, windy, cool weather from April through June, we're going to see significant long-term losses of the bees. The flies probably will do better. These are conditions that don't affect them as strongly, but the bees, as our most efficient pollinators and the ones easiest to get to live in your garden, the bees are going to suffer if we continue to have this kind of weather. And the only thing you can do, unfortunately, is to just like cross your fingers and toes about the weather. Make sure that you have good fly habitat, the hoverflies, as a backup, because we've focused primarily on bees in the past and they are more affected by the weather. And be sure to have diverse habitat available in your garden for the bees that are around. But the reason I framed my presentation as I did is my fear that if 2024 is going to become the new normal in terms of spring weather, we are going to see a decline in bees and in early spring pollinator services. The flies can catch up with that, but this could result in a loss of our ability to grow many of the things that obligately are going to flower early, like the cherries and plums. Not because the bees have been poisoned, but because the bees can't fly, or their nests have been flooded, or they've been desynchronized, as we're saying now in the wildlife world, where the bees are emerging after the trees have already flowered. So it's too late. They're going to pollinate something, but they're not going to pollinate your early flowering fruit. So let's hope that that's not what happens. But this is one of the areas where what our lab is working on is thinking about what food resources we have that don't depend on early spring pollination, that we may have to have our entire food system shift to a shorter summer growing season, rather than what we've been able to enjoy in the temperate, moderate Mediterranean Northwest, is to have an early growing season that extends well into the summer, but starts like in March. And that may not be possible anymore. Let's hope that it isn't that bad, but that's what climate change is about.
We'll be watching your studies.
Thank you. Yes.